For much of Boston, the biggest problem with the housing market is rising costs, but the downturn remains a problem for many tenants and homeowners, especially if there's a questionable foreclosure. At the State House, there's a bill to break the deadlock by setting a tight deadline for challenges to property ownership. Our guest favors a different approach with more protections for consumers. We'd like to welcome the coordinator of the Mass Alliance Against Predatory Lending, Grace Ross. Thank you very much for being with us.
Absolutely.
Well, the people who want the deadline, obviously we're not talking about homeowners or tenants here, so who are we talking about?
Well, the folks who filed this piece of legislation, Senate 1981, are the title insurance industry. Because if there are titles that are all messed up because the foreclosures, vast majority were illegal, they even admit the vast majority were illegal, they can't insure without worrying about having to pay out an awful lot for broken titles. So they want a bill to prematurely just wipe the slate clean, pretend that nothing bad ever happened to anybody and move on. And of course, very bad things have happened to many people. And between the subprime lending, which everybody now agrees was illegal, all the evidence that those mortgages were illegally targeted, particularly at our communities of color, single women head of households. Those were the folks who then couldn't get loan modifications and then ended up foreclosed, often also illegally. So we feel like normally as a society, when there's clear discrimination and the violations have been extreme, we don't usually say, oh, let's just pretend it never happened and make it go away that way. We usually try and get restitution for folks. So that's basically where we are, and we're proposing something different. Let's get a foreclosure review court that would expedite clearing up the mess. The King Solomon situation, you know, older woman lost her home to a predatory lender, new family buys the place. Let's put those folks together in a court with a judge and come up with something that's equitable.
Well, let's go to the other extreme here, because I know that there are also people in the real estate industry concerned. They want the deadline because they say, what if somebody buys a house, they find out a year later somebody who bought it 7 transactions ago comes trying to claim it and says that they were dealt with unfairly, so they should get it back. I mean, how do you prevent that from happening?
We've seen a lot of those cases, and we've actually got somebody who came to us who's facing a foreclosure because she was given a bad deed. So taking away people's rights under foreclosure is not protecting the new owner who turns out not to be the owner. We all know, and I keep using this analogy, you know, I drive up in a gorgeous Porsche and I have the key and I say, Chris, I want to sell you this Porsche. You don't know whether I own it or I stole it. And if I stole it, your issue isn't with the person I stole it from. Your issue's with me. I've swindled you out of the money. In our society, we understand if the banks are the ones that illegally foreclosed, they owe you for selling you a bad bill of goods, and they owe the party that they took the home illegally from. And what we should be looking at is who's the party at fault here, and how do we hold them accountable for the new folks too. If that person buys a bad deed, this bill doesn't solve the problem that 10, 15 years from now they want to start a small business. 70% of small businesses are started off the mortgage of the founder of the business. They want to start a new business. They go to get a mortgage, and the new bank looks at it and says, wait a second, this foreclosure was illegal. They only figured it out 5 years after this bill passed that that type of illegality existed, but now we know, and we're the bank, and that foreclosure was illegal, and there was a second mortgage holder out there for $120,000. So, Chris, we'll give you a new mortgage, but we're going to subtract out the $120,000 in case that second mortgage holder ever shows up. That scenario is all too likely. This bill doesn't address a real equitable solution for everybody who's been wronged, and our courts are prepared to do that. And that's where we need to go. We need a new court that is expert judges who expedite these problems. We actually agree with the industry that there's a problem. We just think it's way bigger than what they're looking at. And so their solution is not going to fix the big problem. It just saves them money so that they can cut their risk down enough so that as an insurance industry, they're willing to insure.
So how do you, I mean, we have a land court already, we have housing court already, so how do you fund this new specialized court?
Well, first of all, it would take a bunch of those cases out of courts that are not necessarily prepared to deal with them, right? A lot of people are in housing court because they got foreclosed not through the courts in Massachusetts. Their first shot at being in court is when the bank's trying to evict them. They're in housing court, but a housing court judge is supposed to be deciding cases in 15 minutes. We had a guy bring in a $600 650-page stack of all the legal documents, and the housing court judge said, is there a Cliff Notes version of this? Understanding that she has a legal obligation to understand it, but 650 pages in a court where you're supposed to be moving a case maybe in every 15 minutes, there's no way. So our housing courts are hopelessly overwhelmed by this stuff. Those are not the judges that have the expertise in this area. There are some judges who have delved into this very complicated stuff with great gusto, and when the state sets up a specialty court, it usually attracts the judges who are attracted to that issue. Let's get the judges who want to deal with this. Let's do it in one place so that you're not bouncing, as you just said, land court, housing court, superior court, one-stop shopping, whether you're a new purchaser or the person whose title may still be valid, who supposedly lost the home. One place where you can go, get this figured out, get it expedited. In 2012, the state passed legislation that if the title problem was created by the bank, and you're a third party, the bank has to pay your court costs, the bank has to pay for clearing the title. So if we had a court, the money for people to afford to go to that court has already been identified who will have to pay. So now we need a place for people to go. It'll cost something, but it's cheaper than the mess we have, let me assure you.
What we're also hearing from the industry is that, well, if people end up losing the house and they shouldn't have lost it, well, they have other recourses. They can maybe, you know, bring a suit, bring some kind of claim and get some kind of compensation.
Right, so the industry thinks of a home as money, but people who live in a home think of it as the place where their grandmother, you know, lived until she died, or the place where those marks on the wall where your kids' heights are, right? What matters is in a home is so far beyond the money. And I think because the very wealthy are used to seeing as homes as investments, they're missing what did one of our lawyers called it, core shattering experience of losing your home, losing the income from the rental property, losing, you know, your home business, the daycare you ran, the place where your kids went, you know, lived and went to school. I mean, I think that this misunderstanding that you can replace the loss of a home with a little bit of cash is only something that folks who are very wealthy would think.
One of the other things that's different about this era, too, is the way we finance home purchases, because, you know, at one time, yes, you could have been a deadbeat, or maybe you just could have been dealt a raw deal, but now there's so many intermediaries involved, it's hard to tell what's
well,
what.
And the banks that kept the mortgages instead of what they call selling them on the secondary market, getting somebody else to fund them, have done way better by people. When these mortgages get sent from party to party to party, nobody really has skin in the game. They're all just passing the buck to somebody else. And that's why these legal messes have been created in the first place. The subprime mortgages that everybody knows were illegal and were illegally targeted to folks, they still got passed along. All the banks bought them. They all made a chunk of money and then passed it on to somebody else. We have to recognize that this is one of the largest wealth transfers upward that's ever happened in the history of the United States. We have an obligation as a society to bring that money back, not just to the folks who were wronged, but the neighborhoods that were wronged, the state of Massachusetts that was wronged, our economy that was wronged. And if we just shut the door and pretend it'll all go away, we are not going to get justice even at the state level for what's been done to us.
Thank you very much for being with us. Grace Ross from the Mass Alliance Against Predatory Lending. Still to come, we'll talk about the Latin Quarter Arts Festival in Jamaica Plain.